November 23, 1942, Stratford, Connecticut, 11 a.m. A low hum vibrated through the crisp morning air, growing into a mechanical roar that drew eyes upward from the factory floors of the Vought-Sikorsky plant. High above the Long Island Sound, a shape that defied every known law of traditional aerodynamics banked steeply against the gray autumn sky. It was a golden-hued, disc-shaped craft, looking more like a visitor from a distant galaxy than a product of American industrial might. This was the Vought V-173, the proof of concept for what would eventually become the XF-5U, a machine affectionately and derisively known as the Flying Pancake. While this radical experiment clawed for altitude over New England, thousands of miles away across the international dateline, the sun was rising over the Philippine Sea at 6 a.m. There, the undisputed master of the Pacific skies, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, was patrolling the carrier lanes in a graceful, lethal arc. The Zero was the elegant sword of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a masterpiece of lightweight engineering that had humiliated Allied pilots from the devastation of Pearl Harbor to the swirling dogfights of the Coral Sea. For years, these two diametrically opposed philosophies of flight existed in separate universes. One was a proven killer reaching the twilight of its dominance, while the other was a radical vision of a future that promised to rewrite the rules of aerial combat entirely. History is often written by the victors, but it is also haunted by the ghosts of what might have been. If the gears of American production had turned just a little faster, and if the strategic winds of the Pacific War had shifted, these two icons of the piston engine era might have met in a duel that would have shattered every convention of naval warfare. To understand this potential clash, one must look at the man behind the disc, Charles Zimmermann. He was a visionary who believed that the traditional airplane was fundamentally flawed. He envisioned a craft that could hover like a dragonfly and then streak across the sky at 500 miles per hour. By eliminating the traditional wing and making the entire body of the aircraft a lifting surface, the Flying Pancake promised a speed range that was previously thought impossible. It could take off from the deck of a destroyer at 20 miles per hour and then hunt down the fastest interceptors in the world. On the other side of the ocean, the Japanese Zero represented the pinnacle of traditional design pushed to its absolute breaking point. It was a plane built for a culture that valued offense over survival. It had no armor plating and no self-sealing fuel tanks. It was a glass cannon capable of outturning any foe and staying in the air for hours on. But it was a design that had reached its ceiling by 1944. As the Americans introduced the Hellcat and the Corsair, the Zero began to fall behind, its pilots forced to rely on sheer skill and bravery against superior numbers. But the Flying Pancake was not just another evolutionary step like the Corsair. It was a predator of a different genus altogether. Imagine a humid afternoon in June 1945, at 2:15 p.m., somewhere off the coast of Okinawa. A flight of Zeros, their green paint chipped by salt and sun, desks from the clouds to strike at the American fleet. They expect the heavy, lumbering Grumman fighters they have learned to fear. Instead, they encounter a formation of flat, circular silhouettes that seem to pivot in mid-air. The XF-5U, with its massive articulating propellers, could have slowed down to a crawl, forcing the fast-moving Zeros to overshoot, and then accelerated with a burst of power that no Japanese radial engine could match. The dogfight would not have been a traditional dance of energy and altitude, but a surreal display of physics where the American pilot held all the cards. Yet this encounter remains locked in the vault of unfulfilled history. The Flying Pancake was a victim of its own ambition and the relentless march of progress. By the time the XF-5U-1 was ready for its true flight testing in 1947, the screaming whine of the jet engine had already signaled the propeller's reign. The Navy, looking toward the horizon of the Cold War, saw no place for a wooden-propped disc, no matter how revolutionary its lift characteristics were. They ordered the prototypes destroyed, and in a final act of indignity, The airframes were crushed by a wrecking ball that struggled to break the incredibly strong circular structure. The legacy of the Pancake and the Zero is a reminder of a specific moment in time when human imagination was untethered from tradition. The Zero represents the ultimate refinement of a fading era, a beautiful but fragile bird of prey that was eventually consumed by the very flames it helped ignite. The Flying Pancake stands as a monument to the radical what-if, a testament to the engineers who dared to look at a wing and see a circle instead. We are left to wonder about those silent Connecticut skies and the empty expanses of the Pacific, where the ghost of a disk and the shadow of a rising sun never truly met. It is a poignant reflection on the nature of innovation. Sometimes the most brilliant ideas are not defeated by their rivals, but by the simple, unstoppable ticking of the clock. July 13, 1942, in the industrial heart of Stratford, Connecticut, a shape emerged from the Vought hangar that seemed more like a fever dream of science fiction than a tool of modern warfare. It was the V-173, a machine so visually jarring that local residents would soon be calling the authorities to report flying saucers over the Long Island Sound. To the visionary engineer Charles Zimmerman, this was not a gimmick or a toy. It was the ultimate solution to the United States Navy's most pressing operational problem. The project was born from a radical rethink of aerodynamics, centering on the belief that a circular wing could solve the inherent weaknesses of traditional aircraft design. At 9 a.m. on a clear morning, the twin Continental engines were brought to life, spinning two gargantuan wooden propellers that seemed entirely out of proportion with the flat, yellow disc they were pulling through the air. Zimmerman's genius lay in the management of wingtip vortices. In a conventional airplane, air spills over the tips of the wings, creating massive drag and reducing overall lift. By placing massive propellers at the very edge of the disc and rotating them against the direction of the tip vortices, Zimmerman effectively reclaimed that lost energy. The result was a craft that did not just fly. It seemed to levitate. The V-173 could maintain controlled flight at speeds as low as 20 miles per hour, an unthinkable feat for any other fixed-wing aircraft of the era. The Navy saw in this the perfect carrier-borne interceptor. Imagine a fighter that could take off from the deck of a pitching ship with almost no wind across the deck, or a plane that could hover in a high alpha state at a 45-degree angle, waiting for a Japanese kamikaze to cross its sights. Yet, the engineering required to achieve this was a nightmare of mechanical complexity. Because the engines were buried deep within the disc-shaped fuselage, they required a complex system of right-angle drives and long, heavy shafts to power the outboard propellers. At 11:15 a.m. during one early test, the vibration was so intense that the test pilot, Guy Boone, feared the entire airframe would shake itself to pieces before it even left the ground. It took months of painstaking refinement, of balancing gears and stiffening the fabric-covered frame to make the Pancake a viable flight instrument. When legendary aviator Charles Lindbergh took the controls for a series of evaluation flights, he was shocked by how intuitive the machine felt. Despite its alien appearance and the terrifying height of its long landing gear, it handled with a grace that belied its chunky, unconventional silhouette. As the war in the Pacific intensified, the Navy transitioned from the V-173 proof of concept to the much more ambitious XF-5U. This was to be the Skimmer, a metal-skinned monster powered by twin Pratt and Whitney radial engines, producing 1,600 horsepower each. This was the machine intended to hunt the Mitsubishi Zero. While the Zero was a master of the low-speed turn, the Pancake promised to outturn it by using its entire body as a lifting surface. The engineering promised a top speed of nearly 500 miles per hour and a landing speed so low it would make it the safest plane in the fleet. By 3:30 p.m. on any given day in 1944, the engineers at Vought were convinced they were building the plane that would the era of the dogfight by simply outclassing every rival in existence. But the engineering revolution was racing against a much more traditional one. While Zimmerman was perfecting his shafts and gears, the jet engine was beginning to roar in the hangars of rivals. The complexity that made the Pancake so versatile also made it painfully slow to produce. By the time the XF-5U was ready for its full power trials, the war was over and the jet age had arrived with a deafening scream. The Navy, looking at a future of turbines and swept wings, saw the piston-driven disc as a relic of a bygone philosophy. In 1947, the order was given to scrap the prototypes. The skimmer was broken apart by a wrecking ball. Crude and violent for a machine of such sophisticated ambition, the V-173 remains a haunting reminder of a path not taken in the evolution of flight. It represents that brief, shimmering moment in the 1940s when it felt as though every rule of physics was being rewritten in real time. We see in its rounded edges a defiance of the status quo, a refusal to accept that a wing must be a long, thin blade. The legacy of the Flying Pancake is not found in combat records or kill tallies, but in the spirit of the engineers who saw a circle where everyone else saw a straight line. It teaches us that the greatest tragedies of innovation are not the failures, but the masterpieces that simply arrive too late. History is often written by the victors, but it is dreamed by those who dare to make the impossible fly, even if only for a short time over the quiet coast of Connecticut. In the silence of the museum where the lone survivor now sits, the ghost of the disc still whispers of a future that almost was. December 7, 1941, over the blue waters of Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The morning air was suddenly torn apart by the rhythmic hum of Sakai engines and the glint of sunlight on silver fuselages marked with the crimson disk of the rising sun. At exactly 7:48 a.m. as the first bombs fell, the world was introduced to a machine that would redefine the boundaries of aerial combat. This was the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, a fighter that had transitioned from a secretive project into a terrifying reality. To the American sailors and airmen on the ground, it seemed as though the laws of physics had been rewritten. The Zero didn't just fly, it danced. It could climb at angles that seemed vertical, turn within the radius of any opponent, and stay aloft for hours while Allied planes were already gasping for fuel. It was the ultimate predator of the Pacific, a masterpiece of engineering that had achieved the impossible by sacrificing everything for the sake of agility. Created by the visionary chief designer Jiro Horikoshi, the Zero was the manifestation of a single, uncompromising philosophy which stated that weight was the ultimate enemy of the pilot. To meet the Imperial Japanese Navy's demanding requirements for range and maneuverability, Horikoshi took risks that Western designers would have deemed suicidal. He utilized a secret, revolutionary aluminum alloy known as extra super duralumin, which was stronger and lighter than anything the Americans were using. Every non-essential gram was stripped away. The Zero was famously built without armor plating for the pilot and without self-sealing fuel tanks, making it a flying tinderbox. By 10 a.m. on that first day of the war, the Zero had established a psychological dominance that would haunt the United States Navy for the next 2 years. It was more than just an airplane. It was an extension of the pilot's soul, a weapon that demanded absolute mastery and offered absolute lethality in return. Imagine, then, the clash that never happened. If the Vought XF-5U Flying Pancake had been realized just a few years earlier, the skies over the Solomon Islands might have hosted the ultimate battle of radical geometries. On one side, you would have had the American disc, a brute force marvel of structural integrity and high-speed lift, capable of hovering and surviving massive amounts of punishment. On the other side stood the Zero, a needle-thin instrument of grace and fragile precision. In 1942, no Allied pilot wanted to engage a Zero in a traditional dogfight. The standard operating procedure was simple: never follow a Zero into a climb, and never, under any circumstances, try to outturn it. It was a phantom that struck from the sun and vanished before its targets could even center their sights. But the very qualities that made the Zero a masterpiece were the seeds of its inevitable downfall. By 3:15 p.m., on an afternoon in June 1942, Near the desolate Aleutian Islands, a single Zero performed a forced landing in a marsh. The pilot was killed, but the plane remained largely intact. The recovery of this Akutan Zero provided the intelligence breakthrough the Allies desperately needed. They discovered the secret that would break the leg. The Zero was brittle. At speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour, its controls became heavy and sluggish. It could not withstand a heavy burst of .50 caliber fire. While the United States began mass-producing the Hellcat and the Corsair, armored behemoths with 2,000 horsepower engines, the Zero remained frozen in its own perfection. It was a katana in an era that was rapidly shifting toward the sledgehammer. By 1944, the Zero was no longer the hunter, but the hunted. During the Great Marianas Turkey shoot at 2 p.m. on a sweltering June day, the Legery maneuverability could not save the Japanese pilots from the superior technology of radar-guided interception and proximity fuses. The veterans who had mastered the machine in the early years were gone, replaced by young men with barely 40 hours of flight time. The Zero, once a symbol of soaring ambition, was eventually relegated to the grim role of the kamikaze. It was a tragic transformation for a machine that had been designed for the most elegant form of combat. The Mitsubishi Zero stands today not just as a relic of a lost empire, but as a reminder of the dangerous allure of the specialized weapon. It was a plane designed to win a specific kind of war, and when the nature of that conflict changed, the masterpiece became a tomb. We look back at these machines, the Flying Pancake that arrived too late, and the Zero that could not change, and we see the duality of human innovation. One was a future that never arrived, while the other was a present that could not adapt. The Zero's legacy is written in the clouds above the Pacific, a testament to a time when a single designer's vision could change the course of history, and a warning that even the most beautiful wings can be weighed down by the heavy burden of their own leg. In the quiet halls of aviation history, the Zero remains the ultimate ghost, a silver flash in the periphery of our memory, reminding us that in the theater of war, perfection is often a fleeting and fragile thing. June 1942, Stratford, Connecticut. At 10 a.m. on a bright Tuesday morning, the air above the Vought-Sikorsky plant was filled with a low, rhythmic thrumming that didn't sound like any engine the locals had heard before. High above, a strange, ochre-colored disk hovered and darted with an agility that seemed to defy the very laws of aerodynamics. This was the birth of a philosophy that sought to rewrite the rules of aerial combat. To the east, across the vast expanse of the Pacific, the Japanese Zero had already perfected the old rules. This was the collision that never came to pass, a battle between the ultimate refinement of the past and the radical, untested promise of the future. Jiro Horikoshi, the mastermind behind the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, worked under a philosophy of extreme efficiency. In his world, every gram of weight was a sin. To Horikoshi, the airplane was not just a tool, but an extension of the pilot's will, a mechanical embodiment of the samurai spirit. By stripping away armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks, he created a fighter that could turn inside its own shadow. It was a philosophy of the rapier, sharp, light and deadly, but fragile if parried. At 2 p.m. in the heat of a tropical afternoon, a Zero pilot felt invincible because his machine would never fight him. It obeyed every twitch of the stick with a grace that American pilots, their heavy, lumbering Wildcats, found terrifying. The Zero didn't just fly. It danced. On the other side of the world, an engineer named Charles Zimmerman was dreaming of something entirely different. His philosophy wasn't about refinement. It was about revolution. Zimmerman looked at the traditional airplane and saw wasted potential in the form of drag and stalls. He saw the wingtip vortices, those swirling air currents that bleed energy, and decided to turn them into an advantage. By placing massive, slow-turning propellers at the very tips of a disc-shaped wing, the Flying Pancake didn't just fly through the air, it harnessed it. The XF-5U was designed to be a living contradiction. It was meant to fly as slow as 40 miles per hour, essentially hovering over a carrier deck, and then accelerate to over 450 miles per hour in a vertical climb that would leave any traditional fighter choking in its wake. If a Zero and a Flying Pancake had met at 11:15 a.m. over a contested island in 1945, the engagement would have looked like nothing else in history. The Zero pilot would have relied on his traditional horizontal turn, confident that no American plane could follow him into the tight radius of a dogfight. But the Pancake wouldn't have played that game. Its philosophy was based on high lift, high angle of attack maneuvers. It could have pulled its nose up until it was literally standing on its propellers, maintaining controlled flight at speeds where the Zero would have long since stalled and fallen out of the sky. The Pancake was a technological brute forced into a shape of deceptive simplicity, a disk that transformed the air itself into a playground of physics. Technologically, the XF-5U was a marvel of hidden complexity. It required a massive internal gearbox to synchronize the two engines, ensuring that if one failed, both propellers would still spin to maintain balance. It used a specialized articulated propeller system that allowed the blades to change pitch and angle, functioning much like the rotor head of a modern helicopter. This was the American philosophy of the era: solve the problem with superior engineering and industrial power, no matter how complex the machinery became. The Zero's technology, by contrast, was an exercise in minimalist perfection. It used a simple, reliable radial engine and a lightweight airframe that pushed late 1930s technology to its absolute limit, leaving no room for the weight of the future. But by 3 p.m. on the metaphorical clock of the Second World War, both philosophies were facing a cold, new reality. The Zero was a victim of its own early perfection. It was so specialized for maneuverability that it had no structural margin to grow. It could not carry the heavier guns, the thicker armor, or the massive engines required to stay competitive as the war evolved. The Flying Pancake, despite its incredible potential, was a victim of timing. As the first XF-5U prototypes were finally being readied for their full-power maiden flights, the sound of the first jet engines was already echoing across the desert of Muroc Dry Lake. The Radical Diskwing Fighter was a piston-driven masterpiece, arriving exactly when the piston era was ing. When we look back at these two machines, we see more than just steel, wood, and fabric. We see the divergent paths of human ingenuity under the pressure of total war. The Zero represents the pinnacle of the classical fighter, a bird of prey that mastered the skies through elegance and sacrifice. The Flying Pancake represents the bold, often messy reach for the impossible, a glimpse into a future where the shape of an airplane was limited only by the imagination of its creator. In the dogfight that never happened leaves us with a haunting question about the nature of progress. Is it better to be the absolute master of a dying art, or the lonely pioneer of a future that arrives just a moment too late? The legacy of this clash of philosophies lives on in the shadows of every stealth fighter and vertical takeoff jet that followed decades later. The Zero taught the world that agility has a price that must eventually be paid in blood, and the Pancake proved that radical thinking is the only way to break the barriers of the known. They remain two of the most fascinating what-ifs of the 20th century, reminding us that in the relentless pursuit of the horizon, the most beautiful designs are often the ones that burn the brightest before they vanish into the light of a new age. August 15, 1945, off the coast of Kyushu, the Pacific air is heavy with the scent of salt and high-octane fuel as the sun climbs toward 10 a.m. In this reconstructed reality, the bureaucratic delays that plagued the Vought XF-5U have been swept away by the desperate needs of an XD invasion of the Japanese home islands. Below the clouds, a lone Mitsubishi A6M Model 52, the venerable Zero, patrols the coastline. Its pilot is a veteran of the Solomon Islands, a man who knows that his aircraft is a relic of a vanishing era, yet he clings to the agility that once made it the terror of the skies. At 10:15 a.m., he spots a glint of silver reflecting off the waves, but the silhouette is unlike anything he has been trained to identify. It is not a Hellcat or a Corsair. It is a perfect, shimmering disc, screaming through the air with a low-frequency thrum that vibrates in the pilot's very teeth. This is the Flying Pancake, the Vought XF5U, finally unleashed from the experimental hangars of Connecticut and thrust into the crucible of combat. As the two aircraft close the distance, the tactical disparity becomes immediately apparent. The Zero pilot, following years of instinct, attempts to draw the American into a low-speed turning duel. He believes that no American fighter can match the Zero's wing loading or its ability to carve tight circles in the sky. But the Pancake is not a conventional fighter. As the clock strikes 11 a.m., the engagement begins in earnest. The American pilot pulls back on the stick, and instead of a wide, sweeping arc, the silver disc tilts upward at an impossible angle. Because of its unique all-wing design and those massive, counter-rotating propellers that cover the entire leading edge, the Pancake does not stall. It simply hovers on its own thrust, assing like a helicopter while maintaining the forward profile of a fighter. The Zero pilot maneuvers frantically, trying to find a line of fire. But every time he thinks he has the deflection shot, the Pancake shifts its position with a vertical authority that defies the laws of aerodynamics. By 11:20 a.m., the reconstruction shows the Pancake utilizing its most terrifying advantage, its speed range. While the Zero is trapped in a narrow envelope between its stall speed and its structural limit in a dive, the Pancake is comfortable at both 40 miles per hour and 500 miles per hour. The American pilot dives, then pulls into a high alpha maneuver that would snap the wings off any other aircraft. He slows down to a crawl, allowing the Zero to overshoot, and then, with a roar of its twin Pratt and Whitney engines, the Pancake accelerates with a linear force that leaves the Japanese fighter behind in a blur of silver. The tactical reality of 1945 was one of transition, where the internal combustion engine was reaching its absolute zenith. In this phantom dogfight, the Zero represents the perfection of the old world, a plane built for a type of chivalrous, close-quarters combat that was already dying. The Pancake represents the radical, almost alien future. It was a bridge to the vertical takeoff capabilities of the modern age, a design that looked at the traditional fuselage and saw only unnecessary drag. If these two had met over the crashing waves of the Pacific, it would not have been a fair fight. It would have been a slaughter of the familiar by the fantastic. The Zero's twin 20mm cannons would have struggled to find a target that could change its altitude and velocity with such unpredictable violence. By 12 p.m., as the hypothetical sun reaches its peak, the reconstruction concludes not with a fiery crash, but with the realization of a shifting paradigm. The Zero pilot looks back and sees only the empty sky where the silver disc had been just seconds before, a ghost of a machine that moved too fast to be caught and too slow to be outmaneuvered. This encounter serves as a profound metaphor for the Second World War itself. It was a period where human ingenuity was pushed to the breaking point, resulting in machines that felt like they belonged to a different century. The Flying Pancake and the Zero are two sides of the same coin, one reflecting the ultimate refinement of the past, and the other a bold, albeit premature, leap into the future. They remind us that history is often written by the things that almost happened, the designs that lived in the dreams of engineers and the fears of pilots. In the quiet transition from the age of propellers to the roar of the jet, these phantoms of the air remain as monuments to a time when the sky had no limits and the horizon was only the beginning of the unknown. August 15, 1945, at 9 a.m. in the humid air over Tokyo Bay, the world stood at a precipice where the old world of warfare was finally being dismantled to make way for the new. While the signatures on the deck of the USS Missouri signaled the greatest conflict in human history, they also sounded the death knell for a generation of experimental aircraft that had been born from the desperation of total war. The Mitsubishi Zero, which had begun the war as an untouchable specter of the Pacific, was grounded, its engines silenced and its wings destined for the scrap heap or the quiet halls of museums. Meanwhile, halfway across the globe in Connecticut, the Vought XF5U, the Leggery Flying Pancake, sat in a hangar as a silent testament to a future that would never arrive. These two machines, representing the absolute pinnacle of their respective philosophies, would never meet in the sky, leaving us only with the ghosts of what might have been. In early 1947, at 2 p.m. on a grey afternoon, the Navy issued the order that would finally the saga of the Flying Pancake. Despite its incredible performance during taxi tests and its promise of a zero-length takeoff, the project was cancelled. The era of the jet had arrived with a deafening roar, and the complex, vibration-prone gearboxes of the XF5U were suddenly seen as relics of a bygone age. When the wrecking ball finally struck the airframes, it didn't just destroy metal and fabric. It shattered a vision of aviation that dared to rethink the very shape of flight. Charles Zimmerman's dream of a disc-winged Defy was sacrificed on the altar of the jet turbine. A technology that offered raw speed over the intricate aerodynamic trickery of the Flying Pancake. Yet, to look at the Zero and the Pancake is to see the dual nature of human ingenuity. The Zero was the ultimate refinement of the past, a machine honed to a razor's edge through weight reduction and pilot-centric design. It was the perfect dogfighter for an age that was already dying. The Flying Pancake, conversely, was a premature leap into a future that lacked the materials and propulsion to support it. It was a design that anticipated the short takeoff and vertical landing capabilities we see in modern fighters, like the F-35 Lightning II. The Pancake was not a failure of imagination, but a failure of timing. It was a bridge built toward a shore that hadn't yet emerged from the fog of the future. The dogfight that never happened between these two icons serves as a powerful metaphor for the transition of the 20th century. On one hand, you have the Zero, a symbol of a nation's pride and its tragic overextension, a plane that was eventually asked to do the impossible as the tides of war turned. On the other, you have the Flying Pancake, a symbol of American experimentalism and the restless search for a technological edge that could defy the laws of physics. They are the two S of a spectrum, the refined classic and the radical rebel. Their missed encounter reminds us that history is not just a collection of events that occurred, but a gallery of possibilities that were left behind in the rush of progress. As we look back at the grainy black and white footage of the V-173 skipping across the grass, or the elegant lines of a Zero diving through the clouds, we are reminded of the courage of the test pilots who strapped themselves into these machines. Men like Boone Guyton, who pushed the Pancake to its limits, and the nameless Japanese aviators who realized too late that their beloved Zeros were being outpaced by history. Their legacy is not found in kill counts or victory tallies, but in the lessons learned about lift, drag, and the human spirit's refusal to be grounded. The echoes of these experimental giants still ripple through the skies today. Every time a modern aircraft utilizes bled wing bodies or vectored thrust, there is a faint shadow of the Flying Pancake. Every time a pilot marvels at the harmony between man and machine, there is a whisper of the Zero's grace. They remain as monuments to a time when the sky was a laboratory and the horizon was a question that demanded an answer. The true value of these phantoms is not in who would have won the fight, but in the audacity of those who dared to build them. They teach us that even the designs that never see combat and the machines that up in the furnace contribute to the upward climb of humanity. They remind us that the most profound legacies are often written in the things we almost achieved, leaving us to wonder what else might be waiting just beyond the clouds of our own imagination.